I'm Lisa Itzkowitz with the New Rochelle Public Library, and on behalf of my partner libraries, Dobbs Ferry, Irvington, Mamaroneck, Pound Ridge, Tuckahoe, and Yonkers, welcome to tonight's program, Six Scholars, Six Books, presented by David Rose, Archivist of the New Rochelle Public Library. So in celebration of Women's History Month, David's going to share with us an inspiring program that spotlights six pioneering women scholars, and I will leave the details to David. David, as I said, is Archivist of the New Rochelle Public Library. He is a writer, amateur mycologist, and contributing editor of Fungi magazine, for which he writes a column, Notes from Underground. His recent writing in Fungi explores the origins of mycophilia, enthusiasm for mushrooms, in the peasant cultures of Russia and Eastern Europe. David was formerly archivist for the March of Dimes and advisor to the Jonas Salk Legacy Foundation that educates about the importance of life-saving vaccines. His talk this evening presents the lives and writing of six women scholars who made lasting contributions to their various fields of study. So you can tell David is a super smart and interesting guy, and I love working with him and talking to him. Just a few housekeeping things. Please keep yourself muted. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we will, or David will address them at the end of the program. David's remarks should run about an hour, maybe slightly less. And with that, I'm going to turn tonight's program over to David Rose.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks very much. And I always appreciate your help with the technology and introductions. Thanks to everyone for being here. And I will tell you a little bit about the genesis of this this presentation. I had been reading 5 of the 6 women that I will be discussing tonight over the years, and it seemed to me that they had something in common, even though they were very diverse. And a couple of years ago, I was working on family archives that involved the printing industry in New York City, and I came across the work of Beatrice Warde, and that's the 6th one, and I added them together, and I think they make an interesting ensemble. My talk tonight is going to be from a prepared text, so I will get started, and we'll have questions at the end. So here we go. There are many ways to focus on the accomplishments of women, and I chose historical scholarship for the context that it brings to our understanding of history, education, science, and art. So how do we define a scholar? A scholar is one who receives instruction at a school, one who learns from a teacher, a student of knowledge in its largest sense, one having great knowledge of literature and philosophy, an erudite person, specifically a man or a woman of letters. Most importantly, scholars use specific methods, principles, and practices to make claims about their subjects of expertise as valid and trustworthy as possible. This method advances teaching, research, and practice of an academic field of study through rigorous inquiry. Scholarship refers to the attainments in science or literature. Scholarship is creative. It can be documented, replicated, and elaborated. It can be and is peer-reviewed. Ralph Waldo Emerson suggested that the main influences on scholarship were nature and history, especially history found in books. History must be known by laborious reading, and books are the best type of influence about the past. Books are meant to inspire creative reading as well as creative writing. Emerson believed that it is the scholar and not the journalist who commands penetrating vision to identify facts amidst appearance by careful observation. Of course, Emerson's bias was towards men and not women. So let's start with Jane Ellen Harrison, a British classics scholar. She was a hyper-polyglot. So what does that mean? She spoke many languages. She spoke and read 16 languages, including French, German, Latin, Ancient Greek, and Hebrew. She learned several languages from governesses as she grew up, eventually to become a pioneer of the modern study of Greek religion. Her biographer, Mary Beard, described her as Britain's first female professional career academic. She was renowned as one of the most intellectual women of her time, as a founder of modern studies of Greek culture and history. Yet her professional life was a succession of disappointments and setbacks. She was a woman in a man's world of scholarship. However, from 1898 to 1922, she taught classics at Newnham College, a women's college at the University of Cambridge in England, and she retired at 72 to spend 5 years learning Russian with political exiles in Paris. Her memoir, Reminiscences of a Student's Life, was published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf's Hogarth Press in 1925. Harrison was influenced by the first principal of Newnham College, Anne Clough, who insisted that, quote, women can work far more effectively where all the arrangements of the house are made to suit the hours of study, where she can have undisturbed possession of one room and where she can have access to any books that she may need, end of quote. This practical recipe for independence portends Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, by 20 years. Of course, one irony was that at Newnham College, women were barred from using the university library. So she wrote 2 celebrated books at Newnham, Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion and Themis, a study of the social origins of Greek religion in 1927. These were products of decades of research into pre-Homeric Greek culture. Themis was interdisciplinary, moving authoritatively through anthropology, classic studies, and archaeology. The book revolutionized the study of early Greek religion by focusing on archaeological discoveries. In Greek mythology, Themis was a matriarchal goddess, the personification of justice, law, order, and custom. Harrison's breakthrough discovery was that the essence of Greek religion was not to be found in the Olympian gods, and that Homer was not the starting point of Greek literature. Her anthropological insight was that religion is not the search for God, but a projection of the beliefs of a cultural group requiring the study of customs, ritual, art, and material culture. Early in her career, after a brief period as a high school teacher, Harrison met Sir Charles Newton, who was in charge of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum. He was impressed by her vivacity and invited her to lecture groups of elderly women about ancient Greek relics. Francesca Wade wrote, quote, soon, Harrison was making a living through her perambulating lectures about Greek art to well-to-do women. Over the next decade, she traveled the country, delivering theatrical performances designed to bring alive the spirit of ancient festivals, dances, and sacrifices. She dressed in spangled satin gowns, strings of Egyptian beads, and a glittering shawl that she shrugged off her shoulders at moments of high drama. She would dim the lights to simulate nocturnal mystic worship and launch into peals of fluent Greek. Her patronizing style displayed numerous affectations of speech at a time when stylish amateur theatricals were all the rage. With long lace cuffs and feathers in her hair, she lectured with great erudition on art, archaeology, and comparative religion. Yet she claimed to be uncomfortable adapting scholarship to a mass audience. One little boy was asked whether he liked her lecture. He replied, not the lecture, but I liked the lady. She was like a beautiful green beetle. Prior to Jane Harrison, classical scholarship was purely literary and focused on the editing of important text. During her formative years, the science of archaeology expanded with a host of dramatic discoveries throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Formerly, the only way to study archaeology was to work at the British Museum, an opportunity that was largely foreclosed to women. But Harrison traveled widely with archaeologists to study tracings from Greek vases, and so the study of mythology and Greek art became the foundation of her research and discovery. Both the Prolegomena and Themis were based on her research in Crete. She came to realize that in order to understand Greek religion, one must recognize cultural precursors who did not engage in rational thought. From there, she discovered cultural survivals that were matriarchal and matrilineal, that religious cults were in the hands of women, and that art and ritual come together in Greek drama, that art is frozen ritual, and that religion is not what we feel, but what we do. The notorious Welsh artist Augustus John, the grand old man of British portrait painting, was known as much for his brawling, drinking, and promiscuity as his fashionable artwork. Harrison believed him to have real vision, and she was delighted with the result of his portrait of her. He painted her in black lace, reclining on a sofa while chain-smoking cigarettes with her friend and fellow classics scholar Gilbert Murray. The economist John Maynard Keynes noted John's arrival at Newnham College for this portrait, and he remarked, quote, "Augustus John is encamped with 2 wives and 10 naked children. I saw him in the street today, an extraordinary spectacle for these parts," end of quote. One wag remarked that when Augustus John lived in Chelsea, he would walk down King's Road and pat every child on the head in case it was one of his. His granddaughter Rebecca called him the Mick Jagger of his day. In a room of one's own, Virginia Woolf pointed out that women were barred from education and the professions as their social worth depended upon their marital status. One consequence of this was that women's lives are almost entirely absent from history. For Woolf, Jane Harrison was a paragon of intellectual freedom for women. Harrison was the first woman to establish a reputation as a professional scholar, though for years, all the academic posts that she applied for went to her male peers. Jane Harrison widened the study of classics through archaeology. She believed teacher and students were equals, and she saw herself as an intellectual revolutionary who never abandoned her scholarly interest in the classics. She believed in the supreme importance of classics in education. The book cover shown here, Square Haunting by Francesca Wade, portrays the lives of Jane Harrison, Virginia Woolf, Hilda Doolittle, Dorothy Sayers, and Eileen Power. This book was one stimulus to my presentation, and I recommend it highly. Our next scholar is the British biologist Agnes Arber, who briefly held a fellowship at Newnham College and achieved scientific recognition despite her lack of an academic position. Arber was not only a biologist, but a philosopher of biology and a historian of botany. Her book, Herbals, Their Origin and Evolution, published in 1912, was the first history of printed herbals. Herbals were the first systematic treatment of plants published between 1470 and 1670. Arber was an expert on plant morphology and aquatic plants. She was the first female botanist to be elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society, the United Kingdom's National Academy of Sciences, one of the most illustrious scientific societies in the world and the oldest in continuous existence. Unlike the flamboyant Jane Harrison, Agnes Arber preferred a quiet life of scholarship in a room of her own, a small laboratory in a quiet quarter of her own home. She wrote 7 books, dozens of papers on grasses, aquatic and plants and flowering plants, and she illustrated her articles with botanically accurate watercolors. Herbals are books containing the names, descriptions, and illustrations of plants prior to the system of modern botany. Arber's history of herbals traces these manuscripts back to their origin in ancient Greece, and then focuses on their preeminent creators from the 15th century. Medieval herbals represent the first attempts to present some systematic knowledge of flowering plants, as arising from the common interest in plants as medicine and food. Arber learned that the chief repositories of plant knowledge prior to herbals were European peasants who were herb gatherers. Many of these plants were so-called simples, herbal plants grown individually for medical use. After the invention of the Gutenberg printing press in 1450, printers began to print herbals from manuscripts. Many were copies printed from various sources, intended for people who had no reference books about medicinal plants. The first British book with plant pictures was known as The Great Herbal, a 16th century work intended to provide information about herbal remedies to a large unlearned public. The Great Herbal was hardly original. Rather, it was a compilation from ancient writers with illustrations from woodcuts that represented the popular aspects of medical botany. The Great Herbal was essentially an encyclopedia, a single-volume compendium detailing the medicinal properties of plants, and the earliest editions are extremely rare. The illustration here is the frontispiece of a garden scene from the 1526 edition, and we can easily guess which garden this is from the figures of Adam and Eve in the 2 lower corners. Arber was equally interested in Italian botanists. This illustration derives from a woodcut by Pietro Andrea Matolium, and instead of flowering plants, we have a troop of mushrooms depicted in their association with evil and toxic principles. Look closely, and you will notice a large snail and two snakes, which tells us more about mushroom folklore than the mushrooms themselves. Of the later history of herbals, Arber tells us that, quote, it was only in the most gradual way that botany ceased to be distorted by man's egoism and plants began to be thought of as creatures with their own lives and relationships, which were independent of human needs and whims. This insight becomes particularly important when we examine Agnes Arber's appreciation of Goethe. In the 1950s, Arber returned to the philosophy of biology with the publication of Goethe's Botany in 1946 and The Natural Philosophy of Plant Form. These explored the foundations of scientific thought as she reviewed the structure and form of plants from an interpretive perspective of philosophy. Her thinking aligned with that of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who believed that science should not only advance our knowledge, but should lead to the transformation of the scientist, a humanistic goal. Goethe's approach seems unorthodox when compared to modern science. It blends an experiential approach with the rigorous empiricism of science. Now, Agnes Arber is not a household name, yet Newnham College honored her just last year in 2024 with this announcement, quote, pioneering botanist and Newnham alumna Agnes Arber has been remembered with a new PhD prize in comparative biology at the University of Cambridge to support the next generation of pioneering botanists to follow in her footsteps. And as an aside, I can't help but mention that the painting of Jane Harrison and the painting here of Goethe find them both in a kind of recumbent position, which is, I think, rather interesting. Marjorie Hope Nicolson was born in Yonkers, New York in 1894. She earned her bachelor and master's degree at the University of Michigan and PhD in English literature at Yale. Facing the difficulties of breaking into male-dominated English departments, she taught high school in Michigan and had short academic appointments before becoming an associate professor at Smith College, where she served also as dean from 1929 to 1941. She left Smith for Columbia University to chair the English and Comparative Literature Department, and she became national president of Phi Beta Kappa in 1939, the first woman to hold that position. An international expert on the literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, she explored the effects that scientific discovery had on literature and poetry. Her book, Mountain Gloom and Mountain Glory, published in 1959, is a surprising study of how our perception of the natural world has been depicted and has been transformed. Specifically, Nicolson examined the Western perception of mountains, noting that up to the end of the 18th century, mountains were not considered majestic or beautiful, but were dismissed as hideous deformities, ugly protuberances that disfigured nature. Until the 18th century, the grandeur that we associate with mountainous scenery was entirely absent. Mountain gloom was the rule. Dante's Purgatorio, seen here, is an example. Mount Purgatory was a symbol and an allegory. Visually, it was nothing more than a mess of broken stones. Nowhere did Dante suggest that we might gain aesthetic gratification from that mountain. Over the course of centuries, after the discovery of the New World, and with the deeper sensitivity of the Romantic poets, there developed associations of nature as a touchstone of spiritual sensibility and the imagination. With Shelley, Wordsworth, and Byron, we encounter a transformation of perception to one in which mountains came to be appreciated as the epitome of nature's glory. With Mountain Gloom and Mountain Glory, Nicolson enriched our understanding of how the subjective perception of ideas and things changes and develops radically over time. In so much of her work, Marjorie Nicolson bridged the gap between science and the humanities at a time when that gap seemed unbridgeable. C.P. Snow, the novelist and chemist, proclaimed in 1959 that there was a permanent gulf between the two cultures of scientists on the one hand and literary intellectuals on the other. Nicolson showed this to be a misinterpretation. She was at home at both worlds. She wrote on the creative influence of science on the literary imagination. She discussed Kepler, Galileo, the role of the telescope and microscope, the notion of infinity, and literature as an imaginative art. Her graduate seminar at Smith on science and the imagination broadened the scope of literature to include fantasy and a focus on female intellectuality as well as the history of science in order to transcend disciplinary boundaries and to explore ideas freely. Her studies underscore the underlying connection among all sources of knowledge from a humanistic approach to literature. Andrea Walton, professor of education at Indiana University, wrote an excellent article about Nicolson, referring to her as the best man in the English department. Walton wrote that despite many offers to assume the deanship or presidency at a women's college, it was the life of scholarship that appealed to Nicolson most. She was the first woman to hold a full professorship at Columbia University's graduate faculty. But Walton criticized Nicolson for her reticence to discuss the frustrated ambitions of her generation of university-trained women, that Nicolson believed women's battles had been won by an earlier generation and that gender consciousness was anachronistic. While she enjoyed the financial independence and personal freedoms gained by the women's movement, Nicolson emphasized scholarship over the fight against gender barriers to broaden career opportunities for women. Her accomplishments in a male-dominated profession reinforced her belief that she had succeeded on her own terms. As for her personal philosophy of education, she believed it is the trained intellect that enables one to perform justly and skillfully in all the offices of public life. She believed in the intimate tie between democracy and humanistic education, that a maturity of vision and judgment is gained by reading widely and deeply in the works of poets, philosophers, and historians, and that the liberal arts must be extended to the masses. She believed that scholarly education should be genderless. And as an aside, I'm sure we could continue to debate that point, but we'll leave that go. I will say that this illustration I have here, Caspar David Friedrich's Wander Above the Sea of Fog, reminds me that there is a Caspar David Friedrich retrospective right now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So you can see this painting in Manhattan through May 11th. Beatrice Warde was an American typographic expert, a scholar of typography and graphic design. She was born in New York in 1900, but lived most of her life in London, where she reaped great acclaim as the publicity manager for the Monotype Corporation. This was a printing technology company that invented the monotype machine that cast metal type for printing using molten metal. Widely known for its typographic excellence, the Monotype Corporation developed many of the most widely used typefaces: Times New Roman, Gill Sans, Arial, and Bembo. I guess we would call these now fonts. Her collection of essays, The Crystal Goblet, or Printing Should Be Invisible, published in 1932, makes the case for typographical design in the interest of clarity of communication and giving voice to democracy via the printed word. Beatrice Warde joined the Monotype Corporation in 1926 as editor of its quarterly journal, the Monotype Recorder. She had already achieved a kind of underground fame with articles about the Garamond typeface written under the pseudonym Paul Beaujean. The Monotype executives in London invited this Paul Beaujean for an interview and were gobsmacked at this vivacious, attractive, intellectual young American woman. She got the job and held it with great distinction for 40 years. She later wrote, quote, "Almost the first thing I did was to disregard the idea of a quarterly publication, saying that a regular house journal was all very well if it were an advertisement, but if it were to be a contribution to scholarship, it should come out whenever there was something worth bringing out, once a year, twice a year, or not at all. Consequently, most numbers of the monotype recorder have become collector's items and are greatly prized." End of quote. Printing is graphic communication by multiplied impressions. For 500 years, it was the only way of broadcasting identical messages to 1,000 or more people, 1,000 or more miles apart. It gave us the means of locating errors and correcting texts. It gave us the possibility of the addition. Beatrice Warde maintained that it gave us something more. She wrote, "Printing is on the side of those of us who still have the courage to say, 'Stop, I want to think about that.' Or, 'Surely that wasn't what you said before.' Or, 'What are you getting at?'" She went on, "It does take courage to say such things, and there is no way whatever of saying that to the reproduced voice that comes to us through a loudspeaker. The future of any form of democratic government depends on keeping that sort of courage alive." End of quote. Now, I will say one thing. In the text that I'm about to read, there was a word that I had to look up. I never heard this word. The word is halation, Halation, and it means the spreading of light beyond edges. So here is one of Beatrice Warde's mini lectures on typography. She writes, quote, "Serifs are by no means inessential ornaments. They enable us to distinguish capital I from lowercase l and Arabic numeral 1. They strengthen the descending main strokes by forming a buttress against the halation of light from the white paper, and they unobtrusively mark the line on which lowercase characters are arranged. Sans serif is inefficient as a book type because the lowercase character have no stress or variation of curve thickening. I give you these points, complete with their typographic terminology, to help explain that the business of the book designer is to give book readers something they value, tranquil-looking pages that render up their content with the least possible interference. In other words, as she said, printing should be invisible." Her most famous production was the broadside, "This is a Printing Office." This piece is a succinct manifesto of typography, embodying humanitarian idealism by promoting the written word. I'll read it all. "This is a printing office, crossroads of civilization, refuge of all the arts against the ravages of time, armory of fearless truth against whispering rumor, incessant trumpet of trade. From this place words may fly abroad, not to perish on waves of sound, nor to vary with the writer's hand, but fixed in time, having been verified by proof. Friend, you stand on sacred ground. This is a printing office." Now, she was once interviewed, and I have a small snippet of the interview here. The interviewer asked her, "What does your work actually involve?" And Beatrice Warde said, "Well, it involves writing many articles and giving many lectures on the history and the design of the printed word, advising innumerable people on how their printed matter should look, book publishers, periodical people, advertisers, and professional people." The interviewer asked, "Does this mean you had to go through the printing trade?" Warde replied, "No, the printing trade is barred to women on the craftsman level. You can't be apprenticed to the printing trade if you're a woman." Typography and the printing trade soon led to the expansive field of graphic design. This example is a location map of Beatrice Warde's Pimlico Wharf address in London. It was designed and cut by her friend Eric Gill as a Christmas card in 1934. The final issue of the Monotype Recorder, published a year after the death of Beatrice Warde in 1969, was dedicated to her memory and subtitled with a description that she had once given of herself: "I am a communicator." the monotype recorder had become a literary monument to hot metal composition before film, electronics, and digital technologies swept it all away. The medium of print has been overwhelmed by hyper-accelerated visual imagery. And I will add here, if you're interested in the history of printing and typography, I highly recommend the 1978 documentary Farewell at Teeuwyn Schroedlu, a fascinating film about the day the New York Times switched from linotype printing machines to computers. Mary Frances Kennedy Fisher, usually known as MFK Fisher, was a food journalist. You might say she was a historian and a scholar of the appetites. She was born in Albion, Michigan, and was educated at several schools in California. Her first books were written during the Great Depression and World War II, and she was later one of the founders of the Napa Valley Wine Library. The Gastronomical Me, published in 1943, is a loving reminiscence of her childhood and maturity, seen through the lens of her affectionate encounters with people, food, and drink. She believed one of her best books was her acclaimed translation of The Physiology of Taste by Jean-Antoine Brillat-Savarin, published in 1826. The full title is The Physiology of Taste, or Transcendental Gastronomy. It presented a philosophy of gourmandise, poetic reflections on the science of cookery, and set the standard for a new genre of literature, the gastronomic essay, which Fisher brought up to an apotheosis in her own writing. Brillat-Savarin was the 19th century savant of gastronomy who loaned his name to the eponymous cheese Brillat-Savarin, a soft-ripened triple cream cow's milk cheese with the rind of the mold Penicillium camemberti. Writing about the culinary arts today has become a veritable industry, and food writing ranges over memoirs, essays, books, and blogs to celebrate eating in the presentation of food as a story. Very often, food narratives ripen into the purple prose of soufflés that sigh voluptuously, or they stumble into cliché overindulgent writers who gush over the sensuous spectacle of lavish sauces or the precious pretensions of quirky cuisine. Without question, Fisher's writing is an early example of this love affair with food nested in literary production. Her books include Serve It Forth, How to Cook a Wolf, Here Let Us Feast, An Alphabet for Gourmets, The Art of Eating, The Cooking of Provincial France, among many, many others. In her collection of essays, Consider the Oyster, she considers the mollusks, a phylum of animals that includes bivalves, clams, oysters, and mussels, gastropods, slugs and snails, and the octopus. She begins, "An oyster leads a dreadful but exciting life," as the first line of an entertainment discourse over the poetry, science, and history of this briny bivalve with its strange cold succulence. In The Gastronomical Me, she recounts her first experience with the oyster. She writes, quote, "I remember hearing mother say that it was vulgar as well as extremely unpleasant to do anything with an oyster except swallow it as quickly as possible without thinking, but that the aftertaste was rather nice. But raw, they must be swallowed whole and rapidly and alive. I knew that I would be sick if I had to swallow anything in the world alive, but especially a live oyster." MFK Fisher justified The Gastronomical Me with the following reflection. She wrote, "People ask me, why do you write about food and eating and drinking? Why don't you write about the struggle for power and security and about love the way others do? The easiest answer is to say that, like most other humans, I am hungry. But there is more than that. It seems to me that our three basic needs for food, security, and love are so mixed and mingled and intertwined that we cannot straightly think of one without the others. So it happens that when I write of hunger, I'm really writing about love and the hunger for it, and warmth and the love of it and the hunger for it, and then the warmth and richness and fine reality of hunger satisfied, and it is all one. And I will point out here the strange machine that's sitting in front of her in this photograph. Does anyone recognize that strange machine? I used to have one of those. The electric typewriter. No one could possibly present a more extreme contrast to the gastronomical me of MFK Fisher than Simone Weil. And by the way, her name is pronounced, the W is pronounced as a V, Weil. Simone Weil was deemed as one of the most original and intellectually and spiritually profound thinkers of the 20th century. She was also mocked as the Red Virgin, the categorical imperative in skirts. Her books, The Need for Roots, Gravity and Grace, and Waiting for God, defy easy summary of the intense spirituality expressed therein. My bio here is adapted in part from her friend Gustave Thibon, a lay theologian. Simone Weil was born in Paris in 1909, the daughter of French Jewish parents. Her father was a physician. To say she was a precocious student is a fantastic understatement. By age 10, she declared herself a Bolshevik. By age 12, she was proficient in ancient Greek. She entered the École Normale Supérieure very young, there to do brilliantly, her subject being philosophy. Thereafter, her primary employment was teaching. She wrote for the journal La Révolution Prolétarienne and embraced the cause of the working class, marching in demonstrations and advocating for workers' rights. She taught in a number of secondary schools, but her revolutionary convictions, which she aired with complete disregard for professional or social conventions, brought her into difficulties with the authorities. She rose above such difficulties with calm disdain. She joined the ranks of left-wing radicals, but never joined a political party, contenting herself with defending the weak and oppressed, irrespective of party or race. Despite her brilliant career teaching philosophy and wishing to share to the uttermost the lot of the poor, she took a job at the Renault Auto Works in Paris in 1934 without letting anyone know who she was. As a trade unionist, she was troubled and incensed over the living conditions of factory workers who were brutally treated as thoughtless machines. Gustave Thibon first heard of Simone from a Dominican priest, Father Joseph Marie Perrin, after the Nazi occupation of France. Father Perrin wrote to Thibon, quote, "There is a young Jewish girl here, a graduate in philosophy and a militant supporter of the extreme left. She is excluded from the university by the new laws and is anxious to work for a while in the country as a farmhand." End of quote. Thibon wrote, "A few days later, Simone Weil arrived at my house. At first, our relationship was friendly but uncomfortable. We disagreed on practically everything. She went on arguing ad infinitum in a monotonous voice, and I emerged from these endless discussions literally worn out. She was just then beginning to open with all her soul to Christianity. A limpid mysticism emanated from her. In no other human being have I come across such familiarities with religious mysteries. She had a deep veneration for the Gospel, the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu Upanishads, Taoism, Homer, Greek tragedy, and above all, Plato. She believed the origin of Christianity was to be found in Greek philosophy. Never have I felt the word supernatural to be more charged with reality than when in contact with her. Every day she came to work, and when she deigned to eat, she had her meals with us. She had suffered all her life with intolerable headaches, but she worked on the land with tireless energy and often contented herself with blackberries from wayside bushes for a meal. Every month, she sent half her ration coupons to political prisoners. Every evening after work, she used to explain the great writings of Plato to me. She did this with such educative genius that her teaching was as living as an original creation. Her thirst to cultivate minds was constant. There was scarcely anyone whom she did not consider able to receive the highest teaching, but she cared nothing for her own genius, knowing too well that true greatness consists in learning to be nothing. She had 3 pivotal religious experiences and drew closer to Christ and to Catholicism, but she refused to be baptized. After the fall of France, Simone and her parents fled Paris to Marseille, and after a time were able to leave France for the United States. She saw this move as a stepping stone to return to England to join the Free French forces against the Nazi invasion. Thibon wrote, "At the station, she gave me a portfolio crammed with papers, asking me to read them and to take care of them during her exile. As I parted from her, I said jokingly, in an attempt to hide my real feelings, 'Goodbye till we meet again, in this world or the next.' She suddenly became serious and replied, 'In the next, there will be no meeting again.' Before she left for America, she said she had a bone to pick with the French government, and there is no doubt as to what would have been her fate if she had still been in France at the time of the Gestapo raids. It was well known that she had helped German communists to flee Hitler's Germany. Her plan in 1943 to combat the Nazis was to organize a cadre of nurses to fly to the front lines to give immediate aid to wounded soldiers. It was a well-intentioned but utterly impractical scheme. Charles de Gaulle led the Free French forces against Nazi Germany in World War II, and when he learned of her plan, he said, "She's out of her mind." Simone Weil insisted that, quote, "One thing alone matters in the world today, the revolution that will feed all the people on earth," end of quote. When her classmate Simone de Beauvoir suggested that the point of life was to find meaning, not happiness, Simone Weil cut her off with the remark, "It's easy to see you've never gone hungry." She believed that people who live by sensation are parasites, both materially and morally, in relation to those who work and create. She thought Christianity was the religion of slaves, and she was fine counting herself among the slaves. She had a habit of denying herself food and sleeping on floors. Her dominant feeling about industrial labor was indignation at the ruling class as she herself confronted the lived experience of subservience and humiliation by working in factories alongside assembly line machine operators. Well schooled in Marxist analysis about class struggle, she felt capitalism was not the ultimate form of social oppression, but that a new, insidious source of oppression resided in managerial bureaucracy buttressed by the cult of experts, an equivalent of fascism. Today, she might find this oppression develop much further in the monolithic power of militarized science, digital technology, and artificial intelligence. In 1942, Simone Weil resided in this apartment building on Riverside Drive in Manhattan before she returned to London. During the last year of life, 1943, she wrote The Need for Roots, prelude to a declaration of obligation towards the human being. Essays and reflections flowed from her pen, including an essay on the abolition of all political parties. She claimed that wherever there have been political parties, democracy has died. She identified the criteria of goodness in truth and justice. And she wrote this: "Only what is just can be legitimate. In no circumstance can crime and mendacity ever be legitimate. Collective passion is an infinitely more powerful compulsion toward crime and mendacity than any individual passion. When a country is in the grip of collective passion, it becomes unanimous in crime." Now, in this photo, you should notice the plaque in the lower left corner near the front gate. You see that little plaque there. This plaque is an enduring remembrance of her time in New York City in 1942. Just a few months later, in The Need for Roots, Simone Weil condemned our false conceptions of greatness in an eloquent and unforgettable analysis. Here is what she wrote. There are 4 obstacles between us and a civilization that may also have value. 1, our false conception of greatness. 2, the deterioration of our sense of justice. 3, our idolatry of money. And 4, the absence within us of any religious inspiration. Our conception of greatness is the most serious flaw and the one we are least conscious of. Our conception of greatness is the very same that inspired Hitler's entire life. When we condemn it without the slightest inclination to look at ourselves, it must make the angels weep or laugh if there are angels who are interested in our propaganda. Now, keep in mind that she wrote these words in 1943 as titanic battles raged. Millions were brutally and pointlessly murdered, and the Holocaust consumed the lives of millions of Jews. She continued, people speak of punishing Hitler, but he cannot be punished. He wanted just one thing for himself, and he has it, and that is to go down in history. Whether he is killed, tortured, locked up, or humiliated, history will always be there to protect his spirit against the ravages of suffering and death. The only punishment capable of penalizing Hitler and deterring little boys from following his example is a transformation of the meaning of greatness so complete that Hitler is divested of it. To achieve this transformation, a person must have accomplished it within themselves. Each of us can, right now, begin Hitler's punishment within our own hearts by modifying our sense of what greatness should be. That is far from easy, because it goes against a powerful and pervasive social pressure, which is that of the prevailing atmosphere. To achieve this, a person must exclude themselves spiritually from society. With Simone Weil, we return to the Greeks. Another of her important essays was the Iliad, poem of force. She believed Homer's Iliad was based on humanity, justice, and charity. She designated force or power as the key idea in the Iliad, and that social prestige forms the very basis of power. In The Need for Roots, she wrote this: there is no other process for learning about the human heart than the study of history, combined with life experience, in such a way as they shed light on each other. We have the duty to feed the minds of adolescents and all people with this sustenance, but it must be a sustenance of truth. Not only should the facts be correct, but they must be presented in their true perspective in relation to good and evil. Simone Weil believed in an identity of the structure of the human mind and the universe, on which she elaborated in her profession of faith in The Need for Roots. She wrote, there is a reality outside the world, that is to say, outside space and time, outside our mental universe, outside any sphere whatsoever that is accessible to human faculties. Corresponding to this reality, at the center of the human heart, is the longing for an absolute good, a longing which is always there and is never appeased by any object in the world. That reality is the unique source of all the good that can exist in this world. That is to say, all beauty, all truth, all justice, all legitimacy, all order, and all human behavior that is mindful of obligations. Although it is beyond the reach of any human faculties, we have the power of turning our attention and love towards it. The combination of these two facts, the longing in the depth of the heart for absolute good, and the power of directing attention and love to a reality beyond the world and receiving good from it, constitutes a link which attaches every person without exception to that other reality. Whoever recognizes that reality recognizes also that link. Because of it, he holds every human being without any exception as something sacred to which he is bound to show respect. This is the only possible motive for the universal respect towards all human beings. The Need for Roots advocated a morality based on compassion rather than the rule of law. And yet Simone Weil saw law as the basis of liberty. The Need for Roots was Simone Weil's last major work before she died in exile on August 24th, 1943, of cardiac failure complicated by self-starvation. Jane Harrison, Agnes Arber, Marjorie Hope Nicolson, Beatrice Warde, MFK Fisher, and Simone Weil. Each of these women is a paragon of scholarship in their chosen field of study, and the homage we pay to them this evening should give us incentive to study their lives and writings even more closely for continuing inspiration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Any questions? I'm just looking.
If there are no questions and you want to write to me, well, I left my library email and my personal email there for you to write me a note in case you're inclined to do that. But thank you all for being here. I appreciate that very much.
There are a couple of Sarah from Dobbs Ferry, one of our partner libraries for this program, did share a couple of tidbits, which are fun. First, she shared one of my poetry professors, Jennifer Franklin, wrote a poem for that exhibit at the Met. It's on the wall at the entrance.
Oh, wow.
And regarding the picture in your slide, the Met commissioned my professor, Jennifer Franklin, to write a poem for the opening of the Caspar David Friedrich exhibit. She chose to write a poem in response to Friedrich's The Monk by the Sea, and will be teaching a class on ekphrasic writing at the Met on April 4th from 6 to 8 p.m. So
Very interesting. Thank you for that. It's good to know.
okay, here is a question from Barbara Crane. Which of these women would have regarded themselves as feminists? Did any of them marry or form families?
Good question. Families. MFK Fisher, certainly. I don't know that much about her personal life. There are biographies and collections of letters of MFK Fisher, but I know she was married, went through a divorce, traveled a lot, wrote a lot, and had children, but I'm not sure about all the individuals in that family. As for the first part of your question about feminism, that's an interesting thing to analyze, because the notions of what feminine is over the last 140 years, say, and the evolution of the suffragists and the feminist revolution that started in the 1960s is rather complicated. So I don't know if I could actually cast myself in the role of one of these women to see whether they would consider themselves feminists in light of the fact that there was an evolution of what that really meant. Nevertheless, it's a good question. I think the biography of Marjorie Hope Nicolson really speaks to that in a way that was kind of a personal conundrum for her when she was confronted with those who said that she should be more active in speaking up for women at Columbia. And she wasn't that much, because she was interested in the scholarship of her study. So that's a whole complicated thing. And actually, I think Marjorie Hope Nicolson was really, has been overlooked, and she really needs a complete biography. I don't know if anyone's writing a biography of her, but that she is a wonderful subject. That's a rambling answer to your questions, but that's the best I can do for now. Thanks for that, though.
Okay. And we have Nancy Bieberman and Roger Evans send kudos to David.
Oh, thank you. Thank
That's
you.
all
Thank you
right.
to both of you.
And several thank yous. One person mentioned she wants to add one of these women's works to her book group. Here's another question from Sarah. Regarding the section on MFK Fisher, you spoke about her interest in food. Could you clarify what was it in her child that sparked her interest in food writing? What was it in her childhood that sparked her interest in food writing?
She starts the gastronomical me with the consideration of that very thing by talking about her relationship with her sister and her father, and going on kind of a long road trip in California, I think in the 1930s, something like that, where road travel was rather arduous, and they stopped for a picnic, and they ate a pie that was prepared for them for their journey, and apparently it was a most delicious pie. I forget what flavor of pie it was, but it all started with that, and she admits that right up front in the gastronomical me. And then, of course, she goes on to discuss her education and her enlightenment with regard to um, food and the enjoyment of food and society. That's the best I can give you for that. I hope that works. Read the Gastronomical Week. Also, How to Cook a Wolf is really interesting. That was written during World War II, when there was a scarcity of many things that we take for granted in terms of sugar and whatever. So that was meant to address the problem of scarcity during wartime, and it's a very entertaining book as well. How to Cook a Wolf. Nice title.
Um, all right, I think aside from many thank yous, I don't think there were any other questions. So last chance. Otherwise, David, thank you. And everyone, thank you for joining us tonight.
Yes,
And
most
keep
appreciated.
checking, I was just gonna say, keep checking all of our library calendars for upcoming events. We all offer just a great variety of programs, and we welcome everyone to come to everyone's programs. The more the merrier.
And may I add to that you're welcome to visit me in the archive at New Rochelle Public Library. You can make an appointment or just drop by. I have all sorts of treasures to show you at any time. So
Yes, excellent. All right, well, thank you, everyone, and good night.